Hello. Today we're going to kind of summarize a little bit of our materials in Unit 6. We're going to talk about kind of the combining of the first two sections we've talked about. Our first section we talked about the economy of the North, the Industrial Revolution, how cities were growing. There were more and more textile mills and industrialization of the North. And then in our second section on Unit 6, we talked a little bit about the economy of the South, how the South began to really depend upon cotton and therefore really depend a lot on slavery for their economic development, and they became much more agricultural as opposed to industrial like in the North. So what we're going to do in this particular section of notes is kind of combine the two, kind of recap what some of the differences are, and then also kind of get you ready a little bit for the next assessment and review just a little bit the impact of the cotton gin and how that impacted the South. Now, you do have a sheet that you'll be working on today, so you'll be writing some of this information down. And if you need to pause it, we can go ahead and pause it a little bit. But go ahead and fill out that study guide sheet as we go through this information. Again, it's kind of a recap of what we've already done, but this will be a great way for you to study for the upcoming test. So we're going to talk first about the economy of the North. Of course, probably the biggest thing about the North is the major focus on industry. So we're talking about factories and commerce. We specifically talked a lot about the textile mills coming into the New England area. So definitely a lot more industrialization happening in the North. Now, I do want to spend just a couple of minutes looking at this map. We'll look at this map a little bit later in the presentation as well. But notice how when they have these symbols here for other manufacturing and textiles, notice how most of those are located in the North. Now, there are some in the South. There are some textile mills that eventually are down in the South. And this map is talking about 1860. So it's going to be quite a bit after the first textile mills are brought over. This is, quite a bit after what we talked about, like the Lowell mills and places like that. But notice all the high concentration of factories and textile mills up here, and then very few in the South. And there's a couple down here, but when you split the country kind of in half here, definite difference in the number of textile mills and manufacturing happening in the North. Second factor for the North is that the North has larger cities and more population. So people begin to move from rural areas into cities, and then those cities really begin to expand. So this is kind of the birth of the United States population shifting from rural into a more city-type based population. And this is going to be happening mostly in the North. So if we take a look at a map, these two maps show 1790 and 1850. And it's kind of interesting. If you look at this map, there's a couple things that are interesting. One, when you look at 1790, you can really tell where the population has began to stop once we get to the Appalachian Mountain Range here. Okay, on this particular map, the darker the color means the higher population density per square mile. So the darkest colors over here are where you have over 90 people per square mile. And then look at what happens by 1850. So this is about 10 years before the start of the Civil War. But the interesting thing on this map is you can see a lot more darker areas here, okay, which means higher population density. And then if you notice on the key, it says that a dot equals a population of 8,000 or more. So at this particular time in 1790, very few dots on the map at all, okay? Then when you look at what happens by 1850, there's a bunch of dots in the northern region and just a couple of dots located in the South. So a definite shift in population when you can see what's happening in the North compared to what's happening in the South. These are two maps that are very similar. This is 1820. Notice that the darker colors are where the higher population density areas are. And then if we shift over to 1850, notice how it shifts west, but also the North becomes much darker as far as population density on this map. So again, 1820, and then just 30 years later in 1850. The other comment about the North is that the North does not rely on slaves as far as a workforce for their labor. They have people that are living in the cities, and they use those people in their factories. So there's not a dependency on slaves in the North to run their factories, to run their economy. they're using other parts of the population. These two maps really show the difference in the amount of slaves in both the North and the South at different times in American history. This is 1790, and then this is 1830. So you can see a definite difference in, first of all, the number of slaves. When you look at anything basically Pennsylvania or further north. So there is just a little bit of slavery in the northern part of the United States. But notice how on the bottom part, or the southern part of the United States, the growth of slavery that expands once cotton begins to really expand here. So very interesting map that shows the growth of slavery in the United States. And now we're going to shift to the South. We're going to talk about the economy of the South. So obviously, the biggest thing we've been talking about, major focus in the South is going to be on agriculture, mostly cotton. These two maps do a good job of showing, again, the difference between 1820 and 1860. The map up here shows the population areas in red, and then it shows the other production areas. Red is the heaviest cotton production, and then kind of the secondary cotton production is in orange. So pretty interesting graph from 1820 to 1860. Notice how it grows to the west here and how much more prevalent it becomes throughout the entire region. Whereas up here it's just this little pocket and then some secondary. Now you've got this humongous range of where people are growing cotton. This is that map that we looked at earlier. We looked at it the first time because we wanted to focus on the factories and the textile mills. Now I want you to focus on the green areas, which depict the cotton as the major crop being grown. So this entire region, you look at Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, up into South Carolina, North Carolina, very, very heavy cotton production. And then this map is probably one of the more interesting maps that we have in this particular presentation because it's a couple things that overlay each other. So if you look where you see the green depicts areas that have over 50% of the population is slave at that time. And then you see what different types of economies are in those specific areas. So we obviously have cotton production. We also have some in the delta down here. We have some sugarcane farming. We've got some tobacco up here. But it's interesting how just you almost overlay exactly where the slave population is heaviest with cotton production and with rice farming, sugarcane farming. So pretty incredible map here that shows the definite tie between these crops and the increased number of slaves. Okay, another factor for the South is the South has a more rural population. Of course, that means not as many people as the North as far as living in cities and such. And we'll go back to that map. And so this time, again, focus on the South here. Not very many cities in 1790. And really, by the time you get to 1850, still not a high percentage of cities. And then just overall, the North is going to have a much heavier population density. So when you look at these maps, it becomes very clear how the population is shifting in the United States as we get closer to 1860 and the start of the Civil War in that time period. Another factor for the economy of the South relies on many slaves for labor. We talked about how in the North they did not rely upon slaves. They used people that were living in the cities. The South is going to be completely dependent upon slavery as far as an economic force. So we go back to this map that we looked at earlier, the growth of slavery in the South. Notice how it expands out west here once we start to get the cotton gin, and there's more availability as far as land going to the west. And then we'll wrap up today by talking a little bit about the cotton gin. Now, we talked about the cotton gin in some earlier notes, but I wanted to really focus on those 4 factors that are a result of the cotton gin being introduced to the South. We did talk about how one person before the cotton gin could clean roughly about 1 pound of cotton in a particular day. That expands up to 50 pounds of cotton and even more than that as the cotton gin becomes more efficient. So wanted to kind of review real quickly here ways that the cotton gin influenced or changed life in the South. Number one, it triggers more cotton production in the West. So people are now going to be taking this land that before was maybe undesirable or not really needed. Now people are trying to grow cotton in as many places as possible. So this map we looked at earlier really shows the growth of cotton in the West. Notice how right here, South Carolina is really kind of the epicenter for where cotton production is. And now look at how it expands into Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and then even into eventually what becomes Texas. Okay, factor number two. It made cotton the king crop of the South. That's a phrase that's commonly used when talking about cotton at this particular time period. It is the crop of choice for people that are living in the South. This is what's going to make them the most money, and so this is what most people plant. Factor number three for the cotton gin. More Native Americans were moved off their land so that it could be used to grow cotton. We talked about how as land becomes more desirable for cotton production, eventually the people that live on that land are pushed off, in this case the Native Americans. So unfortunately the Native Americans are being moved further and further west as settlement continues to encroach upon their land. All right, number four. Factor for the cotton gin or influence of the cotton gin. Slavery continues to be the major source of labor in the South. So unlike what many people thought might happen with eventually slavery dying out, slavery actually becomes more in demand because more and more people are growing cotton and using it as far as a labor source to be able to grow that much cotton, harvest that much cotton, and then eventually sell it. So that's kind of a quick summary of kind of what we've been talking about in Unit 6, what's happening on the industrialized side on the north, and then what's happening in the agriculturally based southern states. I do want you to think about one more thing as we get ready for the test in Unit 6, and that's to think about how these two factors, or how these factors of differences in industry and agriculture are going to create some problems for the country. It's no secret that we're eventually leading into the causes of the Civil War here. So as we talk about the North becoming almost one-dimensional as far as industrialization, not really one-dimensional. I don't want you to think that the North is just factories. They do have some agriculture, but not the same type of agriculture as the South has. But how is their emphasis on industrialization and factories going to conflict with what's happening in the South as they continue to increase the demand for slaves and place more and more of an emphasis on their economy in agriculture? So how is this going to eventually clash between the two sides? This is what I'm going to ask you for on the level 4 question in this next assessment. So how politically are these things, eventually going to be on a collision course to collide with each other? Is it going to be something about, economically, what is the labor force that's used? Is it going to come down to the issue of slavery and if it's morally correct or not? Is it going to come down to the fact of, or become a question of, what should we ship or how should we ship things to other countries? Should there be certain kinds of taxes placed on the things that are shipped to other countries? What kind of issues are going to become a central part of this story as we eventually get to the start of the Civil War? So kind of think about that a little bit. We'll kind of brainstorm in our review session before we take the test. But I want you to kind of think of the facts and the information we've talked about and kind of infer a little bit. Think about how these are eventually going to create a conflict, which is going to lead into the start of the Civil War. So if you have any questions about the two different sections we've talked about here in Unit 6, definitely let me know. But hopefully today's presentation kind of made it a little bit clearer and what the differences are economically between the North and the South. Thanks.